microeconomists. Today we are in chapter 17, our very last chapter. We're looking at behavioral economics and risk-taking. This is definitely one of what I think the most interesting parts of micro. Some of my own research is in this area. So here's how we're going to split this up. We'll first look at rationality, and then we'll look at risk. There's also a lot of other things in human behavior that just seems, I just call them quirks, things that don't seem especially logical, at least at first glance. And your book gives many examples, and I'll elaborate on that as well. So with this chapter, I think your book gets some things wrong, so our approach will differ somewhat from what your book talks about. Now, there's a lot of coverage in the mainstream media of behavioral economics that gets economics very, very badly wrong, so beware of those myths. I'll be sure to point out some of those myths as we go on. So let's start with rationality. So you've probably heard that economics assumes that people are unemotional, are perfectly logical, they never do things on impulses, they're selfish. That is a total myth. Economic theory does not make any of those assumptions. That is not what we mean by rationality. So some of the confusion arises because the way economics uses the word rationality differs from its regular English definition. Now, to make things worse, your textbook tends to further some of those myths. Like I think on the very opening page, it suggests that rationality means that people have no emotions. That is not true. Now, that being said, I think there are some things that economists could do to better communicate and avoid these kinds of misunderstandings. Instead of hijacking an existing word like rational, we could try kind of with a different word that doesn't have some different meaning in regular English. So one phrase out there that is sometimes used in economic literature is preferences are a weak ordering. If you say preferences are rational, people think about the English definition of rational. If you say weak ordering, there's no regular definition for that, so I think that would cause a lot less confusion. To make things worse, in economics, we have at least 3 different definitions of rationality. There's one in micro, which we'll talk about very shortly. There's also one in game theory. There's yet another definition of rationality in macro. This is microeconomics, so I'm going to focus on the micro version of what rational means. But first, we're going to need a couple of preliminaries. So rationality in microeconomics refers to people's preferences. Those preferences are over things that we refer to as bundles. A bundle is just a combination of goods or services. So I have a number of examples up here. So let's say bundle W refers to if you have 4 apples and you have 2 tables and 1 chair. So just some combination of goods. I'm not saying you're mixing them all together. That's not what I'm referring to. It just says this is the stuff you have. This is the stuff you're consuming. Now you could have things in there that are zeros. You could have 0 printers in bundle X. So in bundle X you have 2 computers, but you have no printers, and you have 5 shirts. That's also a bundle. Bundles can include fractions and decimals. So bundle Y could be 4.2 pounds of rice in 1 car. So fractions are not breaking any rules. What's typically not allowed, though, is you typically can't have negative numbers for most things. So I can't have negative 3 pounds of rice. That would not be a bundle. That makes no sense at all. Now, my examples earlier referred to physical goods. It could also be services. Time is also a good. Time has value. So a bundle could also include how much time you spend on stuff. So if you spend half an hour in video games, again, fractions are allowed. So you could spend half an hour in video games and you could spend 3 hours studying. That's another bundle. So some bundle goods, and goods can include services, goods can include time. So bundles can include a very, very wide variety of possibilities. So out of the possible bundles that you could consume, you're going to have some preferences over them. This is the notation we use to refer to your preferences. So let's just say there are two bundles for now, G and H. Of course, it can be more than that, but I'm just setting up some notation. So perhaps you think bundle G is better than H. In that case, you'd write G greater than H. If you read it off in economics, we don't say G greater than H, we say G preferred to H, but it looks like the greater than symbol from math. But instead, you could possibly think that H is better. So in that case, you say H is preferred to G, and you write that as if it were G less than H, to borrow the math symbol. Now maybe G and H are equally good. They could be distinct bundles. There are different goods in each bundle, but those two different bundles could be equally desirable. In that case, we say G indifferent to H, and we use the tilde. So why do you use tilde instead of equals? We reserve the equal sign to mean that two bundles are actually identical. So bundle G were, say, 2 pounds of rice, and bundle H is also 2 pounds of rice, then you can say G equals H. But if G and H are two distinct but equally desirable bundles, then use a tilde. So if you thought, let's say, a slice of cake is bundle G, and a scoop of ice cream is bundle H, maybe you think they're equally desirable, they give you equal happiness, but cake and ice cream are not quite the same thing. So in that case, you write G tilde H, G indifferent to H. So that is our notation. With those foundations in place, we now talk about what does rationality actually mean in microeconomics. So we say preferences are rational, or my preferred term, preferences are a weak ordering. Weak ordering avoids confusion with the English definition of rationality, but the more common term is rationality, so let's stick with that. We say preferences are rational if they satisfy two conditions. Those conditions are completeness and transitivity. So for preferences to be complete, here's what I mean. So for any bundles A and B, either A is better, or B is better, or they're equally good. That seems pretty sensible, right? So one's better than the other, or they're just as good. That would seem to exhaust all of the possibilities. So sometimes in media people say that economists make unrealistic assumptions. That's a very, very realistic assumption. Either one thing's better than the other thing, or two things are equally good. Transitivity is the other component of rationality. So let's say you have three bundles, A, B, and C. And maybe you've decided already that A is better than B, and you think that B is better than C. So if both of those are true, what would seem logical to assume about A and C? Well, if A is better than B and B is better than C, it seems reasonable that A is preferred to C. That's transitivity. So notice, it's very important here, nothing about that definition says people are selfish. So the media says economists assume that people are rational, meaning they're self-interested. That is utter nonsense. This does not rule out altruism. This does not rule out caring about other people. When the media says that economists assume people are rational, by which they mean that people never make choices based on emotion or impulse, that's also utter nonsense. There is nothing about this that says that people are unemotional. You can have emotions and still have complete and transitive preferences. So a lot of misinformation out there. What I think first that misinformation is that, well, first of all, a lot of journalists just don't know any better. Second of all, there are economists who talk to the media, and the economists who talk to the media do know better. Unfortunately, they really dumb things down a lot, and they dumb things down to the point where they start saying things that are just not true. Like saying that rationality means people are perfectly logical. That's not true. So do be careful here. I'm trying very hard that these are complicated ideas, and it's not easy to express them in a way that a intro-level class can understand. However, I do want to make sure I am loyal to the truth here and saying things that are honest. So, some examples of what rationality means and what it does not mean. So, maybe Jeffrey thinks that he prefers chocolate over bacon. Chocolate is pretty tasty, so it's hard to imagine another kind of food beating chocolate, so that makes sense. And he thinks that bacon is better than apples. So, if those are his preferences, what does Jeffrey think about chocolate versus apples? Well, by transitivity, if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A is also better than C. So if chocolate beats bacon and bacon is better than apples, then chocolate should also be better than apples. So nothing unreasonable about that. We're not saying Jeffrey is unemotional. We're just saying he prefers chocolate over apples, and that makes perfect sense based on transitivity. So another example. So perhaps people could prefer one good over another based on some kind of external condition, something in the environment. So maybe you think ice cream on a hot day is really refreshing, where chocolate's always good, but something special about something cold on a hot day. So maybe ice cream on a hot day is better than chocolate. If it's a cold day though, ice cream is going to make you colder, so that's going to diminish the appeal of ice cream. So on a cold day, you prefer chocolate over ice cream. So if you use transitivity, here's what you would find out. You'd say, well, if ice cream on a hot day beats chocolate beats ice cream on a cold day, then ice cream on a hot day is better than ice cream on a cold day. Makes perfect sense. And Megan, in our example, probably feels that way. So does that mean Megan's irrational? Not at all. Ice cream on a hot day and ice cream on a cold day are two different things. They're a different experience. So we're not assuming that people ignore context. You might hear something about that from some misinformed psychology. So some psychology journalists or psychologists might say that in the real world, people care about context quite a bit in decisions. Economists ignore that and build these unrealistic models. That is not true. Your preferences about goods, like ice cream, can depend upon context. Making your preferences depend upon context does not at all violate rationality. So, lots of misinformation out there. I do hope I motivate you guys to learn more about economics. Unfortunately, there's so much misinformation out there. I almost want to say that to learn more about economics, don't read about it, but it's hard to bring myself to say it because how else do you learn about it? You want to read something, you just have to be very careful about what you read. I guess I can put it that way. Alright, here's another example of what rationality means and what it does not mean. So maybe Jerry likes salad and that's his usual thing he has for lunch. He does that every day. Maybe one day he gets bored and on impulse he goes and buys pizza instead. So is that irrational? The economists assume people are rational, but in the real world people think it's based on impulses, so economists are unrealistic. That is nonsense. This is not irrational at all. Actually, this is Jerry following economic logic quite consistently. So back in chapter 16, which you learn about way earlier in the semester, we talked about a very, very important result. I had something in big red letters saying, this is very important. And that thing that was very important was diminishing marginal utility. I had a number of examples of that. So remember, we defined utility somewhat imprecisely as being the happiness you get from consumption. We also noted that marginal utility, that is the extra utility from consuming more, is diminishing. So here's one example I borrowed from my chapter 16 slides. So if you have no TVs at all, then the extra utility, the extra satisfaction you get from getting your first TV could be pretty high. However, if you already have 5 TVs, then getting an extra one, getting a 6th TV, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You probably already have TVs in every room, maybe even 2 in one room in your apartment, so having a 6th one is going to give you little or nothing. So the more TVs you have, the less extra happiness you get from an extra one. We also talked about food being subject to diminishing marginal utility. So if you're hungry and you have a piece of pizza, that gives you some satisfaction. If you've had 4 pieces of pizza already, and now having piece number 5, you're pretty full, and the extra satisfaction you're going to get could be pretty small. Might even make you less happy if it makes you feel too full. So doubling your consumption doesn't double your happiness. So in our example here, Jerry's already had a lot of salad. He's had salad over and over and over again every single day. So the marginal utility he gets from having salad is diminishing. So eventually, the marginal utility from salad becomes less than marginal utility from pizza, which he's had very little of. So he logically prefers pizza over salad, and there's nothing irrational about that at all. Jerry's actually following the law of diminishing marginal utility. Your book talks about brownies. If you have 1 brownie, you're probably going to be pretty happy about that. If you have 4 brownies, you're not going to be 4 times as happy. You're going to be stuffed. You're probably going to feel like you've had too much sugar and too much hyper energy. So nothing irrational about this. So rationality on its own doesn't really give you a whole lot of predictive power. To really get something out of it, you have to combine it with another assumption. That assumption, which is quite critical in economic theory, is called local non-satiation. This is another point where a lot of principles textbooks oversimplify and dumb things down to the point where they start saying things that are untrue. Non-satiation, that's a big word. You can't use that in a principles class. It'll scare people. They won't get it. Actually, you can communicate this idea in a way that is fairly accessible and still honest to the actual idea. I have about 240 of you guys, so odds are pretty good. We have some future grad students and future professors in our midst. So some of you will go into grad school and learn about the precise mathematical definition, and you'll find that my summary here, while simplified, is still honest to the overall idea. So what local non-satiation means in plain English is that for every bundle of goods, there's always going to be some similar bundle that's even better. So right now you can probably think of a lot of situations that are better than your current situation. You probably think it'd be nice if I had more money for food so I could have something other than ramen noodles every day. So you can think of something right now that is better than what you're currently having. As you move up and get a better job at their graduation, you'll probably still find, I wish I could get a bigger house, or I wish I could get a better car. You think of some similar situation that is better than what you currently have. Now, if things go very, very well, and you find yourself rich someday, even then, you can still find something that's even better. So today's Sunday, things go wonderfully, and you have 2 vacation houses, and you have 1 yacht. Even then, you're still not 100% satisfied. You can think of a similar bundle of goods, a similar situation that is even better than that. What's better than having 2 vacation houses and 1 yacht? Well, having 3 vacation houses and 2 yachts sounds even nicer. So you can always find something similar that's better. Now, what's so great about this local non-satiation assumption? Well, when you combine it with rationality, then you start getting some powerful results. So, to simplify a bit, rationality plus local non-satiation gives you the law of demand. Now, to be honest, I gotta put an asterisk there and say, with some exceptions, but it is fairly accurate. So, law of demand we learned about way back in chapter 3 is another one of those big, super important ideas in economics. If you're going to learn just one thing, I hope you're going to learn more than one thing, but if you're going to learn just one thing, that one thing should probably be law of demand. As things get more expensive, people buy less of them. Similarly, if things get cheaper, people buy more of them. So that seems very reasonable. Now that doesn't have to be a separate assumption. Actually, it can be implied by some other economic assumptions. So this foundation of rationality and local non-satiation, you get this very logical result that seems pretty true, that people buy less of goods when they get more expensive, with few exceptions. So I spent some time knocking down myths where the media says in the real world people are not rational because of this and this and this, and usually that's nonsense. Now, that being said, there are some real violations of rationality that do occur. So I cannot claim a complete victory for standard economic theory. So there is a literature in experimental economics, and we often test people on whether they follow the law of demand. Most of the time, even a large majority find people follow law of demand pretty well. There are, however, some times when people break the law of demand. Now, we said before there are some exceptions where you can still break the law of demand and technically be rational. So that does happen sometimes. However, there are some other violations out there where people break the law of demand and we can't defend that. And we can't reconcile some of those violations with rationality. So there are some real issues with trying to reconcile human behavior with rationality. Now, that being said, these violations tend to be very small. So one thing you can show, and I'm not going to go through this here because this does get more advanced, you can show, just believe me on this, that breaking the law of demand does involve wasting money. That makes some intuitive sense. So law of demand says if something gets more expensive, you should buy less of it. So if you start buying more when it gets more expensive and you don't buy as much when it gets cheaper, that's a waste of money. You should have bought when it was cheap and bought less when it got pricier. So breaking the law of demand wastes money. Now, to measure the severity of this breaking the law, you can look at how much money did you waste. So most people don't waste any money at all. Most people follow the law of demand. Those who break the law of demand break it by the narrowest of margins. So in almost all the experience, people never waste more than 5% of their money. So yeah, people do break the law of demand. These violations tend to be pretty small though. It's kind of like the econ version of the speed limit is 55 and I caught you going 57. You broke the law. It's not super severe though. Now, there's also some attempts to disparage the importance of these law of demand violations. They try to say they're insignificant. It is widely believed by economists that if you made the stakes higher, then people would be a bit more careful, they'd put in more effort, and then people would not make any violations of the law of demand. People would follow the law of demand if they had the motivation, had the incentives to care more. So some of you go on to take other econ classes, there's a pretty good chance that you'll actually hear this view stated in the classroom at some point. Now there is some evidence that violations do go down when the stakes get higher. There's a paper by, I think it's Smith and Walker show this result. And also the paper I'm citing here by Kammerer, finds evidence that people follow law of demand better when the stakes are higher. However, there is still this very important conclusion. So Kamara looks at this wide amount of studies, looks at 74 studies, and he finds that they never made irrational behavior disappear just by raising the stakes. So making the incentives higher is not on its own enough to cause people to become perfectly rational. So if in some future econ class you hear professors say something like, in experience people are irrational, but in the real world the stakes are higher, they would become rational, go ahead and raise your hand and tell them about the Kamara paper. So this emphasis here, they said, no replicated study, that's not my emphasis. They actually, in the original paper, they stressed that. So I can see why economists do believe that the stakes are important, that incentives matter. Incentives matter is one of those cornerstone beliefs in economics. We actually call it one of the 5 foundations way back in chapter 1. In economic experiments, it usually consists of a handful of undergrad econ majors recruited by their professor, and they play for stakes that might be as low as $10. $10 is not a huge amount of money. I can see why people would not be super careful when only $10 are involved. So I see why people would think that make the stakes higher, like make the stakes $1,000, make the stakes $10,000 to talk about real world scenarios, then it would seem logical that people would care more and become fully rational. That's not actually true, though. Oh, there is some work on, we'll talk about this later, about some research on the effect of raising the stakes. That'll be in one of our other sections. So, the very brief summary, I'll put in just 4 words about what irrationality is that it is, first of all, it's real. It does happen in economic experience and the real world. It's also enduring. I can't get rid of it just by making the stakes higher. Another common belief out there is that, among economists at least, is that if you have repetition, people would learn, and they would get rid of the violations of rationality. That is also not entirely true. So it endures to both raising the stakes, it also endures through learning and experience. So it's enduring. You can't just get rid of it by changing the experiment a bit. So rationality is real, enduring, but it's also pretty small. People don't waste a whole lot of their money. The kind of irrationality the media talks about is utter nonsense, though, and is based on a gross misunderstanding of what economists mean by rationality. So to try to deal with these facts, there's a lot of models out there in behavioral economics that are about what's called bounded rationality. The phrase introduced by, I think, Herbert Simon back in the 50s. I think he went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, so he did a lot of very important work. So bounded rationality refers to people have rational preferences, but you have some kind of limitations in your mind and your brain that might prevent you from acting in a fully rational way. The definition is a little bit vague there, a little bit imprecise, because there are so many different models out there and they all have different ways of trying to explain what constraints cause you to behave irrationally sometimes. So now I get to a very exciting moment. I get to talk about some of my own work and how it tries to address this issue. So my paper, we'll call it Wilson 2018, I look at something I called preference discovery costs. So your true preferences are rational. The idea, though, is that figuring out what you truly want takes some work. So I guess I must have written these notes when I was hungry because I keep using food examples. The example I had in my paper, I talked about how much rice you're going to eat. Well, you could talk about that in terms that are very precise. You could talk about, I want to eat 344 grains of rice. Nobody talks like that. We say things like, I want to have half a cup of rice, or we want to have a cup of rice. Now, if I really thought about it, I probably could figure out exactly how many grains of rice I want to eat. but that's a lot of work. I'll just kind of approximate half a cup, and even if it's not exactly half a cup, looks kind of about right, we'll just go for it. So I don't want to do the extra work to figure out what I truly prefer, because if I'm off by a couple of grains, that's not going to matter a whole lot. Spend a lot of effort to figure out the precise number of grains to get, that's just not worth it. So if somebody watched me in the kitchen how many grains of rice they'll eat each day, maybe they'll find some small violation of rationality. I would argue, though, that it's not really irrational, because figuring out the exact number of grains of rice to eat takes a lot of work, and the benefits of that work are pretty small. It actually makes sense to be a little bit imprecise, even if that risks some slightly irrational behavior. So once you account for this cost of effort, Wilson argues, then people are rational. That's one model out of many of bounded rationality. So that wraps up our section on rationality. Be sure to join us for our next episode in which we look at risk.